Thank you very much, Mary. That's absolutely wonderful. So, yes, I'm here today to talk about work that we've been doing over the last few years at Staad near Streager in County Sligo. And the RIA very generously funded some of the paleo-environmental analysis and also the radiocarbon dates as well, or some of the radiocarbon dates as well. So we're very, very grateful for that. So to give you some background, first of all, the site lies on the coast of Sligo. It faces into the Atlantic Ocean towards the early medieval monastic site at Inishmurray. And what we have is a very small rectangular church which sits close to a low sea cliff. And the name Staad comes from the Latin statio, meaning a stopping point or a station. And it's thought that the church was built as a way station, really a chapel, a pilgrimage chapel for travellers going out to visit the site at Inishmurray. So it's a multi-period site because the site that I'm talking about today turns out to be Bronze Age and not medieval at all, which was a bit of a surprise. So modern archaeological work started at Staad back in the 1990s with a project on coastal shell middens. And then in 2000 and 2001, Jerry O'Sullivan went to the site with Finbar McCormack, who had done the 1990s work, and they made a second, more detailed study of the site, and they carried out some excavations there. And then in 2012, myself and Jerry decided to see whether there'd been much coastal erosion and damage done since the excavations back in the 2000s. Both in terms of the church building itself and also in terms of the midden that was visible in the little sea cliff below the church. But 100 years before that, the artist and antiquarian William Wakeman had visited the site, and he painted this image of the church that you can see at the top here. It shows the ruins of the church and the gable wall, and you can see a photograph of exactly the same place in 2012. And you can see that it's recognisably the same place. And you can see that individual stones are recognisable. What's missing is the lintel over the window. That has disappeared. It's probably gone and made a lintel in a cottage somewhere. The site's got more overgrown, and some of the stones on the gable wall have fallen down as well. At some point, it's going to fall down. There's no doubt about that. But to be honest with you, the missing stones are the least of the problem, because the church will quite possibly fall into the ocean before it gets a chance to fall to the ground. So during the excavations, Finbar and Jerry had cleaned everything back to a vertical face and had then recorded that vertical face. And this is the low sea cliff here. So since then, areas of that face had collapsed. And they'd formed these kind of grassy slumps along the length. So we did hope that although those grassy slumps were erosion in their own right, that they might help to stabilise that sea cliff. And they might protect the archaeology from further damage, maybe building up and covering the archaeology completely. But there was no such luck. That was 2012. And in 2014, this was the site that greeted us. The winter storms in the winter of 2013 to 14 washed away that slump, and they exposed the cliff edge completely again. And since then, that's eroded even more and has fallen down to create a new slump, which in its own way will erode again when the next big storm just happens to come in from exactly the right angle. Now, we know that due to sea level changes, the sea is actually creeping closer. And due to climate change, the frequency of storms is also increasing. But we wanted to know how much of the coast had been lost. So to do that, what we did was we combined various Ordnance Survey maps from the 1830s onwards with the detailed surveys that have been done since 1994. And you can see that 100 years ago, this peat deposit that you can see up in the top right-hand corner, and which is what I'm mainly talking about today, that would have been on dry land. And certainly 200 years ago, in the 1830s, it would definitely have been on dry land. But today, it's on the beach and it's eroding away. And the line of the shore is noticeably moving closer and closer to the building itself. It's not a slow, gradual process. Instead, about 5 metres has gone since the 1990s. And as we've seen, about 80 centimetres actually went in that 2 years between 2012 and 2014. Pretty much most of it in one big storm. So a few more big storms and the church will start to fall in, and similarly the peat deposits are very vulnerable. So the patch of buried peat was visible on the beach in various different shapes and sizes as the stones and cobbles moved around from around about 2015. But in 2017, one of our students at Sligo, Kieran Davis, who took the photo on the left, he found wood emerging from the peat. And initially that wood seemed to be very natural, but after some warm, dry weather that shrank the peat, I was there with a bunch of archaeologists, and we noticed that some vertical posts were sticking out from the peat and were visible from it. And you can see there in that ranging rod, there's one post there just by the bottom of the ranging rod, one up next to the last red section, and there's another one out beyond the length there. So there's 3 in a line in that particular picture. So myself and Sean Gallagher, who is based in the area and who keeps an eye on the site for us, we went along for a day to try to survey in all the pieces of wood that we can see. Now, this image isn't very clear, and I'm not expecting you to be able to see what's on there because I'd need a screen that was the size of the room. But basically all the coloured dots and the little text labels next to them are all pieces of wood that were emerging from that one patch of peat. And as a result of that, I approached National Monuments about running a rescue excavation. And that's basically what we did. So we ran a rescue excavation looking at the pieces of peat, but we also, if you can see the little yellow patch there where it says sand, we also did a larger trench there that was 2.5 metres by 1.2 metres in size. We wanted to see how the peat tied into the beach sand, so what the stratigraphic sequence was, how deep the peat actually went, and we wanted to take a monolith sample. And in the upper layers of the peat, there was evidence for an abandoned stake, and there were also a number of stones that you can see in the picture on the left here. Those had been imported into the peat surface and had been laid down on it. So they might have been there, for example, being used for stepping stones, or maybe they were there maybe as hammer stones to hammer in some of the stakes, or maybe a little bit of both. But they potentially provide us with an insight into the construction methods that were used by the Bronze Age people at Staad. And we dug down, as you can see on the right here, and it started off shallow, and it got a bit deeper, and it got a bit deeper, and it got a bit deeper. So this is Frederica. It's not as bad as it looks. She is actually crouching down, and we did step the trench, so there was no health and safety risk. But we did end up with a trench that was 1.6 metres deep at its deepest point. So it was quite substantial till we got to the bottom of the peat. This is a scale drawing of what we had. showing each of the deposits there. So there were 3 deposits of different coloured sands at the top, and then underneath that there were 3 different types of peat, so we could see visible differences stratigraphically between them. And then at the very bottom we had a grey marl that would have been the bottom of a lake, and there were rounded stones in amongst that grey marl. It was a gritty kind of a marl. So initially, as part of it, we took 2 radiocarbon dates at the top and the bottom, but then the Royal Irish Academy very generously funded some extra dates, and we were able to plot in a more detailed sequence. And you can see that peat deposition started in the Mesolithic period and it ran through to the Late Bronze Age. Initially we examined wood, and since then we've also examined plant macrofossils, pollen, spores, microcharcoal and insects through the time that was represented by the monolith. And again, I'm not going to expect you to be able to read the charts there, but just to kind of prove that we did them. And I'm going to sort of summarise the results of them. Because of time limitations, I'm going to just focus on the Bronze Age period, which was the period that our wood deposits came from. And there's all the various specialists that did the work. So we came to realise that what we actually had was a lower layer of horizontal bits of wood, and then 2 phases of vertical stakes that had been driven into the peat from above. Now, phase 1 dates from the early Bronze Age, and at that point in time, the plant macrofossils show that the peat was very wet and unstable. There were reed swamp conditions, and people were laying down loose pieces of wood onto the surface of the peat. Generally speaking, these didn't seem to be tightly packed, so they might be considered to be maybe occasional aids for getting across the peat or to cross particularly wet pieces of ground. And the wood was mainly willow, and it's likely that that was available in the immediate area. There was also some hazel as well, and both of those species are common in the pollen record. And the pollen and the insect evidence put together suggests that there was limited tree cover before this, but at that point there was a regeneration of woodland in the wider area. But there's also fungal spores and microcharcoal evidence that suggest clearance and that suggest grazing animals as well. And that's borne out by the insect evidence, which also shows the presence of dung beetles specifically on the immediate area. So this is a settled landscape with a peaty patch, a peaty lake, half-infilled lake in the middle of it. And you can see here some of the horizontal pieces of wood that we excavated. We couldn't do a large open area excavation on it. We were literally focusing on pieces of wood that we could see. So then in phase 2, there was time between the 2 for peat to grow over the platform or the trackway or whatever it was, and for it to become hidden. And about 500 years later, in phase 2, you've got several rows of vertical stakes, again made from hazel and willow, but these are set vertically into the ground. And there's probably at least 2 different occasions that this occurred based on the dates. Some of these actually punch through the original trackway. So if you look at the picture up at the top, you can see that there's a vertical stake that has actually punched through a horizontal piece of wood there. And then that vertical stake has eroded away, the top part of it has eroded away as the peat has eroded away. A lot of the stakes showed beautiful evidence of woodworking where they've been chopped through with axes. Now again, at the time that this was laid down, the area was wet and it was marshy, and that's evidenced both by the plant macrofossils and by the insect remains. At that time, there's a reduction in tree pollen, So that indicates that the environment was becoming much more open. And there was a high proportion of dung beetles, or dung spores, I should say, although the insect remains don't actually show any dung beetles at that time. So the two are a little contradictory. Maybe grazing was taking place in the wider area, but not actually on the peat deposit itself. So a couple of hundred years later again, people again set vertical stakes into the ground during phase 3. These were a bit wider in diameter than the pieces of wood in phase 2, and one of them, one of them again was willow. These were found at the highest, most eroded parts of the peat horizon, so it's likely that others from this phase have disappeared over time. By this time, the tree pollen had fallen to a very low level, and it's never recovered since then. There was a peak of open indicators amongst the insects, and there was a high proportion of sedges in the pollen and plant macrofossils that suggest that it is still fen conditions, it's still alkaline conditions, but the ground is getting much more stable. And there were salt-tolerant insects at this point in time, and the organic content of the peat is dropping. So it's suggesting that there was inundations and incursions of the sea by that point. And then eventually the sand completely covered the peat deposits in the late Bronze Age, so around about 800 BC, in the 800s. So the vertical stakes in phases 2 and 3 weren't randomly laid out. In both phases, their lines either following the line of the sea, the sea is off to the top left, or set at right angles to the line of the sea. So that means they're sitting on bog, there's perfectly good dry ground within a few metres away, they're not laid down in water, and they're not houses because there's perfectly good dry land to build houses on. Instead, they're associated with some kind of activity on the peat. So my best guess is that these could be supports for something like hunting hides or wildfowl nets. None of the lines of stakes show any signs of wattling, so anything that was connecting those stakes was something removable, maybe fabric or netting or leather, which suggests occasional or seasonal use. And a site like this would be perfect for example, trapping migrating birds in a similar technique to what you see here from the 19th century. So throughout the Bronze Age, Staad was evidently a place of significance in the landscape, and this freshwater lake would have provided valuable resources to communities living nearby. The reeds and the rushes could have been collected for thatching and craft working materials, and in drier periods, the peat surface would have provided a source of edible herbs and seeds and fruits. Wild birds could have been trapped there, and ground nesting birds could have been targeted for meat and for eggs. And Staad itself is well placed on the coastal landscape. It's a relatively sheltered bay. It's got a rock-cut pull-in for boats, and the sea would have provided an important routeway up and down the west coast and out to islands like Inishmurray. There's also a number of prehistoric monuments nearby. There's a barrow and a kist burial, and that shows that the area was ritually significant, and it was imbued with meaning, with memory, and it was a settled landscape, as we can see from the pollen records and the arable weeds in the peat monolith. So the excavation here has provided important evidence for paleo-environmental history, for sea level change, for erosion, and for changes in climatic and environmental conditions between the late Mesolithic and the late Bronze Age, and then again into the medieval period in terms of the upstanding archaeology. And we hope to publish this soon, and we hope to perhaps even do more work there again. These things seem to keep on growing. So, thank you very much for listening. Thank you as well to everyone involved with the project, in particular National Monuments for funding the initial excavation, and the RIA and Queen's for funding towards specifically the paleo-environmental results. And of course, the landowners, Christine Feeney and John and Catherine Harron as well. Thank you.